Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is presented by Sports Field Management Association. Leading up to SFMA's annual conference, we will be hosting various webinars that preview conference education sessions. The 2023 SFMA conference takes place January 16th to 19th, 2023 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Registration is open, so make sure to head over to the SFMA website and register for the conference. And the early bird deadline is actually coming up on the 15th. Our featured speaker today is Brad Park, Research and Outreach Agronomist at Rutgers University. He will be presenting a preview of his conference education session, Tall Fescue for Sports Fields and Grounds. Attendees will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. Please type in your questions and we will answer them after the presentation. Thank you for joining us today. You can go ahead and get started.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Appreciate the introduction, and want to thank Sports Field Management Association for the opportunity here on this cold Tuesday afternoon in central New Jersey to give this presentation on Tall Fescue for Sports Field and Grounds. I wanted to just quickly mention the title. I wanted to be very specific about saying sports fields and grounds, because I think many of our sports field managers here in New Jersey, throughout the mid-Atlantic region, particularly those working at schools, municipalities, and in that sector, not only are they managing sports fields, but they're also managing common areas. They're managing areas in front of the library, in front of administrative buildings. And so tall fescue as a turf grass species, as a cool season turf grass species, I think has a place beyond just sports fields, and can be a very, very nice fit and a good species choice for those types of areas as well. So again, I wanted to make sure I got that into the title. A little bit, some bullet points here on tall fescue. You can see its current Latin name assigned by the taxonomists. If you're keeping score at home, Schedonorus and arundinaceus. Bunch type growth habit. There are some very, very kind of slight rhizomatous traits associated with some tall fescue varieties. However, I think in general we still consider it a bunch type growth habit, and that translates into a relatively slow lateral spread, particularly when we compare it to something like Kentucky bluegrass, which is strongly rhizomatous. It's capable of developing a deep root system, rapid establishment when seeded at the right time. Specifically here, again, kind of northeast mid-Atlantic, latter part of August through the month of September. Good drought, heat, insect tolerance. We'll talk about some of that. And then some disease characteristics here that I want to mention. It's a species that's not susceptible to summer patch disease. Okay, that's a big problem. There can be a big problem with Kentucky bluegrass. Tall fescue is susceptible to brown patch disease, and that is a major, major challenge with this species, is its susceptibility to that particular disease. And then susceptibility to gray leaf spot. At least here in New Jersey, New York metro area, I would kind of consider this still at this point an emerging disease problem. You see on the screen that I've highlighted, not susceptible to summer patch, the brown patch, gray leaf spot. When we mix tall fescue with Kentucky bluegrass, we can at least try to address some of these disease issues. Tall fescue is going to provide a benefit to Kentucky bluegrass from the standpoint of no summer patch susceptibility, with Kentucky bluegrass being a summer patch susceptible species. Kentucky bluegrass, not particularly susceptible to brown patch. That's going to help out the tall fescue in mixtures. Gray leaf spot disease, tall fescue has some emerging problems associated with this disease. Not a problem in Kentucky blue, so Kentucky blue is going to help out the mixture in that regard. This is a nice slide provided by Dr. Bill Meyer, longtime turfgrass breeder here at Rutgers University, recently retired about 6 months ago. What I really like about it is kind of shows where we generally consider tall fescue to be established. And looking here at the map, it's really kind of in that southern section of the traditional kind of cool season zone, throughout the transition zone, and maybe in the northern section of the warm season zone. We're not going to see it down in the kind of the tropical climates of the Gulf Coast, Florida. And the second level limitation is kind of in some of these northern climates. Not that it won't survive up there, but I think that its winter hardiness is challenged, kind of in the Interstate 90 corridor, perhaps, when you think about upstate New York, and then into kind of Wisconsin and Minnesota. A very good friend of mine and colleague from University of Minnesota, Dr. Eric Watkins, he came out to our New Jersey turf conference last week, and he indicated that in Minnesota, where they try to use tall fescue, often they'll seed it in the spring, and those younger seedlings, if seeded during the fall, so if seeded in kind of September, latter part of August, those younger plants are particularly susceptible to some of the harsh winters that they experience in Minnesota. So they're able to kind of overcome that, or their way of trying to utilize tall fescue is through spring seedings. I thought that was an interesting piece of information that he shared again at our meeting last week in Atlantic City. Where I think tall fescue has a nice fit is where we're essentially managing sports fields and grounds north of 2.5 inches, above 2.5 inches. And it's a species that really will maintain a fairly upright growth habit in this kind of 2.5 to 4 inch cutting height. Oftentimes, species like perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, we can mow these species at 3 inches, but they'll often kind of they'll lodge over at those higher cutting heights, whereas tall fescue, again, we can push a 4-inch cutting height and the plant will tend to stand upright. Now, is that going to be appropriate for soccer, for a baseball infield, field hockey? Obviously, no. But again, thinking about general grounds areas, particularly areas where there may be limited management inputs going forward, we'll talk about some of those. That's where this species, I think, can be a real benefit, particularly in the mid-Atlantic states, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, southeastern Pennsylvania. This is a great image. One of our Rutgers undergraduate hourly students was the backdrop here, but this was a variety called Rembrandt tall fescue. Now, this was seeded in 2006, September 2006. The image was taken in October of 2011, so 5 years after seeding. These are our soils at Rutgers Hort Farm 2 in North Brunswick, New Jersey. Now, this is actually a loam. All right, so there's silt and clay, a little bit of sand in this profile, but you can see the uniformity of the soil profile down to a 14-inch depth. And at under a 3-inch mowing height, no irrigation applied in 2011, and only 0.9 of a pound of nitrogen per thousand square feet in 2011. Image again taken on October 14th. You can see the roots that are down, 13 inches into that very, very well constructed soil product. It's actually imported soil from on campus. It's a long story, but anyway, this soil, it's a quality soil. It is very subject to compaction whenever it's manipulated. We take very good care at the farm whenever we're establishing trials. Use a lot of kind of farm type equipment to manipulate soils, but when it's given a good quality soil to grow in, it does have this ability to develop this very, very deep root system. So whenever I make visits to many schools, municipalities throughout the state, this is something I encounter from time to time. Obviously not a very high quality surface, but what's alive in this field, the cool season turf grass that is a percentage of the ground cover. There's a lot of bare soil in this outfield. It's actually tall fescue. So again, I think the argument here for tall fescue is where we have these kind of lower input sports field and grounds situations. What do I mean by lower input? Reduced irrigation. Perhaps it's no irrigation. Perhaps it's irrigation with only a water reel. Minimal fertilization. Less than 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. I'm just going to throw that out as an example. Minimal pesticide inputs and minimal mowing inputs. So where we're only mowing maybe once a week, maybe once over 10 days, mowing at that limited frequency, we're going to have to raise the mowing height up 3 inches or so. And that's where tall fescue, I think, again, is going to provide a very good quality turf at that cutting height. Many municipalities and schools have a lot of acreage. And again, this kind of gets into this mowing question where, we've got some school districts in the state, particularly in the southern half of New Jersey, that have, acres and acres of natural turf grass, sports fields, as well as grounds. And, they simply can't mow any more than once a week, given the labor, given equipment, so forth. So having a species that will provide good turf quality at 2.5 inches or 3 inches, that's where I think tall fescue makes a lot of sense. This happens to be a horse track in southeastern Pennsylvania, very, very high quality stand of tall fescue. They probably have somewhere between 11 and 12 acres of turf grass on the turf course at that particular facility. Tall fescue actually works very, very well for them. This is a interesting field that Dr. Elmore and I came across back in the spring. It's managed by Mr. Keith Fisher. He's a sports field and grounds manager at this public school property. It's a high school property in Ocean County, New Jersey. So the Atlantic Ocean is right over here. Very much, I would say, kind of a transition zone type environment. Very, very high quality soils. I was really, really impressed with the quality of soils there. And this field is predominantly tall fescue. Here's a look at the image of the field. You can see there's soccer, there is lacrosse, and this is a non-irrigated, again, what I would kind of characterize as a predominantly tall fescue field. Keith sent this got a little grainy, but Keith sent me this image on October 19th. We had a very, very hot summer in 2022 here locally in New Jersey. Very, very dry summer as well, particularly the months of July, the months of August. And this non-irrigated, again, predominantly tall fescue field, here's Central Regional High School, down the shore, so to speak, weathered the summer and the kind of the harsh summer conditions that we experience here in New Jersey very, very well. And it's an example where a few inputs and a little bit of TLC, tall fescue can work very well, as it is in this particular sports field situation at a New Jersey high school. This is a slide that I routinely show when I'm addressing some audiences that are very, very tuned into fewer pesticides, no pesticide inputs. And I think where you've got tall fescue and you are managing it 2.5 inches or above, there are some pest control implications here that I think are worthy of note. Weed encroachment implications. At 2.5 inches, at 3 inches, tall fescue can form a very, very competitive turf. And when you've got that type of competitive turf surface, there's going to be fewer weeds that encroach. Gets us towards a situation where we're using fewer herbicides. White grub implications. If you've got a quality soil of adequate depth. Now, I realize not everybody has got that situation, but I showed you that image of Keith's field. I showed you the image of Hort Farm too, where you've got a very, very, you've got a soil profile that's, 8 inches, 9 inches to a foot in depth. And if that plant will mine deeply down into that profile. This gives the opportunity for the plant to develop some white grub tolerance. So this is not like an endophyte. This is not going to mean it's going to resistant from any kind of white grub feeding. But the more roots you have, if there's a little bit of white grub feeding in the soil, that plant is better able to tolerate that feeding. And then endophyte enhancement during the Salt Lake City talk next month, probably try to get into a little bit deeper dive into this subject. And cutting height is not going to affect whether the variety of tall fescue has sufficient endophyte in it or not. But if we can identify some endophyte enhanced varieties, this is going to provide us some protection against surface feeding insects, chinch bugs, sod webworms, bill bugs. All right. So again, a number of kind of of what I would call minimal pesticide input implications here for tall fescue when it's managed at a higher cutting height. One of the challenges or one of the comments that I get from time to time about tall fescue, and I don't disagree with this, is that tall fescue forms clumps. And I asked the question whether some of this clumpiness, and I guess I asked the question I guess kind of just in concert with some of the anecdotal observations that I've made over the years. I think sometimes it's related to establishment, where tall fescue stands, other turfgrass stands just don't get established very well. And I think tall fescue, given its strong bunch type characteristics, this clumpiness in tall fescue gets amplified if it's not established very well at the outset. And here's just some examples of this. I mean, here's a single plant, tall fescue plant in a kind of a fine fescue stand. Very, very poor establishment in this particular field. Again, a lot of this clumpiness where you've got kind of individual plants here and there with other stands that are either in a very, very thin stand of other turf grasses, or again, from what I can tell, just not established very well at the outset. Can we overcome some of these clumpiness issues with better establishment practices at the outset? And I just want to refer to some seeding rates here. This is from Dr. James Beard, 2002, in his Turfgrass Management for Golf Courses textbook. And he's recommending anywhere between 7.5 and 11 pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet as a seeding rate. I think sometimes we think about tall fescue as 4 pounds. We see the NTEP test at 6. And I think for NTEP, this is probably sufficient. I mean, we're seeding in frames, or we're seeding by hand. But for larger operations and so forth, I think trying to get a little bit higher on the seeding rate, minimum of 8 pounds per 1,000, I think that makes sense, particularly where we're seeding into bare soil. When we seed at the right time of year within the ideal seeding window, this happens to be September 24th. I'm sorry, these particular strips were seeded on September 8th, 2010. This image was taken 16 days after seeding on September 24th. A little bit difficult to see over here, but where I got my cursor, this is the tall fescue beginning to, form a pretty good ground cover. Here's the ryegrass, a ryegrass strip already in need of mowing 16 days after seeding. You can see the bluegrass here trailing behind. This particular variety, as I recall, was Falcon 5. Here it is a year or so later in the, kind of here in the foreground of the slide, forming a very, very high quality turf. Not clumpy by any stretch of the means. And again, I would kind of attribute that to the seeding practices and the seeding rate and the seeding timing at the outset. We've got a lot of quality tall fescue varieties to choose from now. I think Kentucky 31, if we're looking at kind of utility turf, roadside turf, parking lot, airport, something like that, I think that brings Kentucky 31 into the equation for consideration. But we've got so many new improved turf types, and if there's any expectation to mix tall fescue with Kentucky bluegrass, I think we want to be over here in this direction of choosing a newer, improved turf type. Better density, darker green color, finer leaf texture. And again, if we're going to mix with Kentucky bluegrass, these newer turf types are just going to mix so much better. On this subject of mixtures, let's talk a little bit about the subject of mixing tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. I think the preferred mixture is 90-10 by weight. 90% tall fescue, 10% Kentucky bluegrass by weight. That translates into a 50% tall fescue, 50% Kentucky bluegrass by seed count. Tall fescue is a much larger seeded cool season turf grass compared to Kentucky bluegrass. Hence, to get an equal number of seeds in a mixture, an initial seeding mixture, we have to account for the difference in seed size by ensuring that from a weight ratio, we are not at the 90% tall fescue and 10% Kentucky blue. I mentioned earlier on in the talk about some of the disease balance, so to speak, that can be achieved by mixing the two species. We're going to get some gray leaf spot tolerance in the mixture by supply by adding Kentucky bluegrass. We're going to get summer patch tolerance in the mixture by using tall fescue, and we're going to get brown patch tolerance in the mixture by using Kentucky bluegrass. And then this is just another image here from Dr. Meyer. Here's Kentucky bluegrass. You can see the relative size of Kentucky bluegrass compared to tall fescue. And again, the need to go on this 90-10 weight ratio by weight in order to achieve 50-50 seed count. Want to talk a little bit about a research trial that we performed at Rutgers over a number of years. And again, the Salt Lake City talk will go into this in a little bit greater detail, but we wanted to look at some different cool season turfgrass blends and mixtures, implement fewer fertilizer, irrigation, and pesticide inputs over a multi-year period, and then see if what mixtures would provide us acceptable or better turf quality. And just to look at a couple of the years here, now this is going back a few years now. The trial was seeded in September 2011. This image was taken on September 4th, 2014. And we had a relatively wet 2014, and without any irrigation, you could see the kind of the turf vigor in the trial in September of 2014. Now let's go over to 2015. All right, very, very dry summer. We didn't irrigate. We wanted to kind of push these things to the limit, see what would survive. Again, seeded in 2011. This image is taken in 2015. By the end of 2015, so this image was taken in November of 2015. All right, got some autumn rains. What survived? Everywhere where you see in all these squares, we can almost play a game of chess out here if they died in an appropriate fashion. But this is all tall fescue, and literally, everything that was not tall fescue, fine fescues, perennial ryegrass, even Kentucky bluegrass, all failed, and the survivor was tall fescue. And this work was conducted central New Jersey, Hort Farm 2 in North Brunswick. Another image I wanted to show you, again, kind of getting back to this tall fescue bluegrass mixture and trying to make an argument for it. Roughly 90-10 by weight. All right, this is on the 31st of October 2014. A perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass mixture. This particular seeding ratio, by the way, roughly 15% and 85% works out to 50-50 seed count. All right. Again, 2014, reasonable moisture, natural rainfall, precipitation during that summer. So we really didn't see a tremendous number of problems. Go out to 2015, again, much harsher summer. That bluegrass ryegrass mixture almost completely obliterated. Whereas the tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass mixture, you can see from a survivability standpoint, very, 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 very good. So again, thinking about this in the context of grounds, thinking about this in the context of non-irrigated athletic fields, I do really like this combination of the two species, tall fescue and Kentucky blue. The Kentucky blue will give you some rhizomatous activities, a little bit better ability for recuperative potential. Again, I think these slides do a pretty nice job illustrating some of these benefits. A couple other benefits here, just to note at seeding. Kentucky bluegrass notoriously slow for germination and kind of formation of turf cover establishment, even when seeded at the ideal timing. And this is an image of some plots that were seeded on September 2nd, 2010. The image was taken on September 24th. This is 22 days after seeding. So this is a strip here of Kentucky bluegrass. Right now, we do have a few babies coming up there, but obviously very slow, very much what we would expect out of this species. When we mix tall fescue with Kentucky bluegrass, that tall fescue gives us, a boost, so to speak, at seeding from an establishment perspective. And then here we are, that same trial going out 35 days. Bluegrass here is starting to catch up, but that mixture of the tall fescue and blue much further along. On the subject of summer patch, this is an experimental selection of Kentucky bluegrass A05361 by itself. and you can see the very classic symptoms of summer patch in that particular plot. Image was taken on August 14th, 2013. Whenever we mix A05361 with Falcon 5 tall fescue, these summer patch symptoms are very much muted in that plot. So again, the argument for mixing the two species, obviously Kentucky bluegrass has got summer patch issues, tall fescue doesn't, and mixing the two species can be a big benefit. So a little bit here on variety selection, just some things I think should be the primary focus of how we select tall fescue varieties. I think turfgrass quality, I always like to put that one at the very top of the list, whatever the species is, whether it's Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, perennial ryegrass, you name it. I think turfgrass quality is a very, very good kind of 30,000 foot, so to speak, trait to rate for, and can do a good job with variety selection looking at this particular parameter. Brown patch and gray leaf spot susceptibility, wear and traffic tolerance, and then endophyte enhancement. Endophyte enhancement may require that you get into some of the cultivar or variety specific literature on various company websites to find out if the company is making a claim that the variety has got endophyte enhancement. The other thing I will mention very briefly about endophytes, the sooner that you can use seed that it's shipped to you and you can get it in the ground, that just minimizes the potential that endophyte is not going to lose viability. The longer that seed is stored, the colder the conditions, the warmer the conditions, that endophyte could potentially lose viability. So as soon as you get the seed, trying to get it in the ground, if it's going to be that late that summer, that fall, that is a kind of insurance policy that an endophyte, if it's in there, is going to have some degree of viability. Just a real quick note here about NTEP. And again, I think in Salt Lake here in another month, get into a little bit deeper dive into some of the NTEP data and some of the traffic data that we are accumulating here at Rutgers. But what I did want to just show, what this is kind of fresh off the presses. If you go to the NTEP website, this is 2021 data from the transition zone. You can see states like Delaware, Virginia, Oklahoma, Maryland. And what I like about this list is we're beginning to see a lot of experimental selections that are now becoming commercially available. And you see what's in the parentheses here. That was an experimental selection at the initiation of the trial in 2018. This is the 2018 test, and it has since gone commercial. And we're seeing more and more experimental selections becoming commercialized, in 2020, 2021, and and then moving forward 2022, 2023. So a good sign as far as availability and commercialization of quality materials. So with that, Kristen, I'm about at the end of my allotted time here. Again, would like to thank Sports Field Management Association for the opportunity. Looking forward to the trip to Utah here coming up next month.
All right, thanks, Brad. We did have questions come in. If anybody has a question, please type it into the Q&A feature. The first question is, how do I get fescue to grow in my soccer goal areas? I have a 90% tall fescue field in Minnesota and it has not held up in the goal areas.
So related to tall fescue, Minnesota goal areas, as I mentioned at the outset, I think Minnesota is one of those locations that's kind of pushing the northern limitation of the species. I think goal creases are always going to be a challenge, number one, just because of the concentrated traffic. We generally recommend high perennial ryegrass overseeding rates. We recommend periodic resodding. If you could, sod those goal creases at the end of every season, perhaps try to use a tall fescue bluegrass mixture. Obviously, you're going to have bluegrass in it, so there could be some kind of texture differences and so forth. But I think gold creasers are always going to be a challenge, regardless of whether it's tall fescue, whether it's bluegrass. Again, we recommend a lot of ryegrass overseeding just as kind of a replacement. But I would, look towards resodding periodically and look towards perennial ryegrass. And again, just kind of recognize that, again, tall fescue, Minnesota, not that it can't work, but it is a challenge up there.
Does tall fescue do well in full sun?
Question is, does tall fescue do well in full sun? Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say that it prefers full sun. But that's a good question to ask, because it will do a little better in the shade relative to things like Kentucky bluegrass and perennial ryegrass. Again, we're kind of thinking about grounds here, but I mean, generally speaking, we think about fine fescue in our cooler season climates for shade tolerance, which is really probably a better word. But tall fescue, I think, behind the fine fescues is second in as far as shade tolerance, but it would prefer, it is going to do much better when it's in full sun, as will all of our grasses.
After an ideal seeding of 85-15 tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass, what have you observed as the true makeup of the plots after year one?
Okay, that's a good question. 85-15. Now that's going to be, just to note, on 85-15. So we're going to go 85% tall fescue, 15% Kentucky bluegrass by weight. I'm going to guess that you're probably looking at seed count. You're probably roughly 60-40 with that mixture, 60% Kentucky bluegrass, 40% tall fescue, just with seed count. So I think right off the bat, you're dealing with fewer seeds of tall fescue. So that's going to potentially give the bluegrass a little bit of an edge. And I would suspect that mixtures like that will move towards bluegrass more quickly compared to a 90-10, or perhaps even a 95-5, 90% tall fescue, 5% Kentucky bluegrass, or 90 tall fescue, 10% Kentucky bluegrass. The other thing, just real quickly on this, and again, probably information for the Salt Lake talk, but Kentucky bluegrass cultivar choice has a lot to do with how quickly these mixtures will transition. And it's a little bit not typically what you think an agronomist would recommend, but the higher quality bluegrass, I'm talking things like, your Midnights types and your America types, top NTEP performers. When you're mixing those with tall fescue, they're just such strong grasses that those mixtures with tall fescue can tend to transition over to Kentucky bluegrass a little more quickly because of the strength of the bluegrass cultivar, the bluegrass variety.
Okay. How will tall fescue do in a dog park?
How would tall fescue do in a dog park? Another tough one. I think if you're establishing a dog park for the first time, I would look at tall fescue. I would either look at tall fescue or I look at a tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass mixture. No question about it. Again, I think you're dealing with something that's just very, very difficult. You've got concentrated traffic. And, again, I'm thinking southeastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, tall fescue. I like it for that particular use. Absolutely. But good luck. I mean, it's going to require some traffic management and probably, seeding over time, introducing new seed, tall fescue, maybe even some ryegrass here and there where you've got the really, really high traffic areas. It's like a gold crease, but you've got dogs.
Have you seen any studies regarding using seed coating for establishment?
Question is studies regarding seed coating for establishment. So this is probably, this question has been coming up more and more. And so it kind of gives me some thought for the Salt Lake City presentation. But I think the only thing you have to be careful with the seed coating is just making sure that assuming that the packaging, reading packaging, understanding the weights of what is in the bag. So if you are dealing with a bag that is 50% by weight inert, basically 50% by weight coating, and you're seeding something for the first time, or you've got very, very thin areas and you're trying to seed it, 4 pounds of seed per thousand, or let's say 8 pounds of seed per thousand, just use that as an example, I would want to use 16 pounds of product. So just account for that difference in, in seed quantity, which 50% of the bag, and make sure that if you're shooting for a seeding rate, a raw seed rate, that you adjust your rate accordingly to account for that inert.
All right, when you sow 90% tall fescue, 10% Kentucky bluegrass, what is the realistic establishment percentage of Kentucky bluegrass within the sward?
I think it's this is not a scientific term, but it's sneaky. You may not see it right away, but over time. So if you're seeding, Labor Day, and here in this part of the country, central New Jersey, mid-Atlantic, a tall fescue is going to germinate, 6-7 days. You'll see babies. Depending on the tall fescue variety, it's going to lag, but it's there. And I mean, some of the work that we've done looking at mixtures, it might not be immediately evident, but it does become a component of the stand. It's just not immediately evident.
Okay. Will the presentation be available at the conclusion of the seminar today? Yes, it will. I will post it. I'm in Pennsylvania, and I find it better if I use 3-way rye on all my fields. I've been finding that rye works better with the amount of constant play on the fields. Do you have any feeling on this?
I don't disagree. I think where you've got very, very high traffic areas, I think perennial ryegrass as an overseeding species tends to be a very, very good choice. I think where you've got minimally irrigated situations, I'm thinking specifically using water reels where, you may only be able to get out there maybe, once, twice a week. And if you had this kind of summer that we had here in New York metro area, it was very hot, very dry. And that might not be enough for ryegrass. So I recommend a lot of ryegrass. Every extension report I author for Gold Creases, it's ryegrass. But again, that's largely for Gold Creases field centers where you're just losing grass and you have to replace it quickly and you're overseeding late into the fall season. But I think where you've got some of these large expanses and you're almost kind of managing areas almost like a golf course rough as far as fertilization and irrigation, pesticide inputs, even mowing height. I think that's where tall fescue I think makes some sense.
Are there tall fescues with very high endophytes?
Yes, there are, and there are testing procedures. And it gets back. You can get your seed tested for endophyte, and our plant diagnostic lab here at Rutgers can do that testing. But if you're going to get seed tested for endophyte, it is incumbent upon then you as the user to get that seed in the ground, soon after testing, so that you ensure that any of that viability in the seed is not lost. And again, as the longer that seed is stored, and the poorer the conditions in which the seed are stored, that is a prescription for a loss in viability.
Okay, we have a question and then a kind of a follow-up. So 90% tall fescue and 10% Kentucky bluegrass. Do you find it bullies the Kentucky out then? And then he followed it up with same percentages with gray leaf spot that could wipe out a large percentage of the grass.
So on the subject of gray leaf spot, again, I think it's important to note we are kind of still calling this an emerging disease issue in tall fescue, at least here in this part of the country. We also think that if it's going to be an issue, it's going to be an issue probably at seeding and during the establishment period in the fall, and less likely to be an issue, in subsequent years. I mean, again, that's kind of the thinking at this point. Now, there are gray leaf spot tolerant tall fescue varieties, and I would so the question underscores the need to, if that's a concern, that the question underscores the need to select a variety that has demonstrated improved tolerance to gray leaf spot. And if you look at the NTEP list, there are NTEP varieties that have demonstrated improved, and they're named as such, and they've demonstrated improved gray leaf spot tolerance, and they are named as such with some type of GLS, GLR type of, similar to the ryegrasses. What was the first part of that question again with the bluegrass?
Do you find that it bullies the Kentucky out? Tall fescue, or yes.
Well, it kind of gets back to that question of, how does the bluegrass establish it? It does establish slowly. I mean, this is why, many sod growers don't see as much of this now, but whenever they would see tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass, and they had a expectation to harvest their sod, within a year, they would use netting. All right. So that's because, the thinking here is that tall fescue gets a jump. The bluegrass is slower to establish, become a component of the stand, develop sufficient rhizomes. So yeah, I think the expectation is that on the front end, the tall fescue is going to jump. But again, the blue, again, the only way I can put it, it's sneaky. It does become a component of the stand. It takes time. But it does. And on the gray leaf spot issue, variety selection was paramount there if you're concerned about gray leaf spot.
When seeding a tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass blend, does cutting height have an effect on which species will establish more quickly or better?
Have not really looked at newer varieties. I mean, conventional thinking would tell us that Kentucky bluegrass would have an advantage at cutting heights. Let's just make some numbers up, less than 2 inches, 1.5 inches and below. And that's probably true for older tall fescue varieties. Okay, so if you're trying to mix Kentucky bluegrass with something like a Kentucky 31 or something else that's a very kind of coarse, open, I would say that a lower cutting height would definitely kind of favor the blue. With some of the newer tall fescues, these newer varieties, I think that's probably less the case, until you start maybe pushing like 1 inch, but at 1.5 inches and above, I mean, we've got some tall fescues that are, again, kind of top shelf, newer varieties that do quite well at that lower cutting height, and I think would be not as susceptible to bluegrass kind of dominating the stand, even at 1.5 inches. But you got to select. I would look at those kind of the top, 2 or 3 statistical categories within the NTEP to make sure you're selecting the best varieties.
What is considered proper seed storage / best practices?
So ideally, any kind of temperature control. So if you are storing a seed in a non-temperature controlled environment, so if it's in the attic of a building that is susceptible to very, very hot, warm summertime conditions, or if you're storing it in a some type of shed, and you're in upstate New York and it gets down to 0 degrees, that would not be acceptable as well. So temperature controlled, dry, Those are the kind of, you want something that's sealed up pretty well as well, because, mice, rodents, seed is a, they'll use your seed as a, as a buffet table.
All right, that's it for questions. Thanks, everyone. Those were great questions. Thank you, Brad. This presentation will be at the Salt Lake City Conference. It will take place Tuesday, January 17th from 2 to 3:15. So make sure that you come prepared with questions. We hope to see you in Salt Lake City. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.